Hello ladies and gents, welcome back to another video and welcome back again to the garage, because today we are going to be converting my good friend Cliff's bike from its current 10-speed state into a 12-speed. Now this is a Giant Defy Advanced 3 and it is a beautiful carbon fibre frame and it is a beautiful endurance bike. However, it did come with a Tiagra 10-speed group set. Now that has served Cliff very well for the last couple of years or so, but the 10-speed is now a little bit dated and Cliff would like something just a little bit more up to date. If you saw part 2 of my London to Paris video a couple of months back, this was the bike that Cliff did that ride on, and as he was going up a particularly steep climb in one of the northern French suburbs, his chain snapped and we had a bit of a problem because I couldn't initially figure out why my 11-speed quick link wasn't working on his chain.
What is going on with that? Why is that not clicking in? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
It was only then that I realised that this was actually Tiagra 10-speed, and that's why the chain link wouldn't work, because it was just a little bit narrower than the 10-speed chain is. So after having a conversation on the rest of the 50, 60, 70 miles of that ride, Cliff decided there and then that he wanted to upgrade the bike. So that is what we are doing today. Now, this won't be a simple swap out, taking all the parts off and putting the new parts on though. No, because that would be far too simple and quite honestly, that wouldn't make a very interesting video anyway. The biggest issue I'm going to need to deal with is actually taking off this giant conduct unit off the front of the handlebars here. Now, if you're not aware, the conduct is a sort of halfway house between mechanical and hydraulic braking. You essentially have brake cables coming out of the shifters into the conduct unit, and then there is a small oil reservoir in there that converts those brake pulls into hydraulic power, and that then powers the hydraulic calipers. Now it does work pretty well, and when you spin the wheels and when you're out on the bike and you pull the brakes, there is quite a bit of modulation and it does work very well. So it is a very good stopgap between mechanical brakes and full hydraulic. However, I know as I'm saying this, there are some of you out there watching this video who are gnashing their teeth and wanting to immediately get in the comments and tell me how awful these units are, because yes, I am aware that there is a high level of hatred for these units online. But you'll be happy to know I'm going to be changing that out and we are going to be going full hydraulic shifters and calipers. So that's the first issue I'm going to have to deal with. The second one, which is almost related to that, is the cable routing, or the hose routing, should I say. I've never seen internal cable routing that goes down through the back of the head tube here. So once I get this all stripped down, I'm going to have to be careful and have a look at that and see exactly where the cables run and exactly how they run into the head unit behind the steerer there, so I can emulate that with the new hoses that I need to put in. So there is a little bit to be done with this bike, but nothing insurmountable, I hope. But the first thing I'm going to do is strip it all down and clean it up. And yes, I know that there are some of you out there who also think that I should clean the bike before stripping it all down, because there were a few comments about that on the last upgrade video that I did, saying that people much prefer to work on a clean bike. And yes, I do agree with that. However, there are certain parts of the bike that are just really, really tough to get to, including behind the crank here and up around the inside of the chainstay. So I much prefer to just get everything off, have full access to the frame, then give it a good clean, and we have a nice clean bike to then build everything back onto. So that's the intro. Let's get on with stripping this bike down and see where we go from there. Okay, well, I've stripped most of the components off and I've come to the part now where I need to start pulling the old gear cables out. And as ever with internal routing, it's not as simple as it should be, unfortunately. So I pulled out of the rear port that comes out of the back of the chainstay for the rear derailleur this little pot with what appears to be like a cable routing guide on the end of it. But it doesn't have a clean cut and it looks like it's been pulled from the inside and broken off what appears to be the rest of the cable routing guide that goes through the frame. Now I want to point out that I didn't pull that off, that just pulled out very easily. So that had already been pulled and broken, if indeed there is a cable routing guide that goes the whole way through this bike. Now, I didn't know whether that was the case initially, but where I've tried to put my cable routing guide through the frame, where I'm sliding it across the top of the cable and then trying to slowly pull the cable out of the front to bring this plastic tubing through, it's only getting so far. So I can only imagine that where my cable routing guide is going down the cable, it's then hitting what I believe is another cable routing guide inside and won't push any further. Now that causes a few problems, because if this part here is the bit that's broken off, that goes about 4 or 5 inches down into the chainstay, which means when I push the cable through, I'm going to somehow have to dig into this rear entry port to try and fish the cable out. Now I do have an endoscope. I'm not sure just how much use that will be. I've tried to put the endoscope down here at the moment, but with the cable in there, the porthole is just too small. So I can't actually get the endoscope down there until the cable is completely pulled out. So it's going to be a little bit of a test of faith here, and I'm going to have to hope that there is some kind of cable routing guide that goes the rest of the way through this frame, and that it isn't going to be that difficult to then feed the cable through and somehow just kind of wiggle the cable around at this end to make it come out of the port here. Now, as with my Trifox road bike, there is a port just under the bottom bracket here that I can undo, which may give me a little bit more of an idea of what's going on down there, but even that is only a very small aperture, so I don't think I'm going to be able to get fingers up inside there to move cables around with that. With the front derailleur, there appears to be a plastic routing guide around the cable as it comes out of the bottom bracket shell. Now again, I don't know if that runs the whole way through the frame. I would like to think that it did, and so when I push a cable through the entry port at the top here in the head tube, I'm hoping it should just push all the way through. Again, this is all just a blind leap of faith, and if it doesn't work out once I've pulled the cables out, well then I'm probably going to have a long old job in getting them back through. Unfortunately, to add to the problems as if that wasn't bad enough, the bottom bracket is push fit, not screw fit. So I don't really want to play around with taking that out. I do have the tool to knock the bottom bracket out either side and then to put it back in again. But Cliff hasn't complained of any squeaking bottom bracket problems as yet, and so I don't want to start giving him any by taking the bottom bracket out and introducing any sort of play when I push it back in. So there's a few things that I need to do here. I think I'm just going to have to rip the cables out and then just trust that there are some cable routing guides built into this frame. And then once that's done, I've got the hoses to deal with for the brakes. Now I do have my magnet mounting kit, so I can screw one of the barbs into the end of the hose here, pull my cable through, and then do the same and pull the new hose back through again. So that shouldn't be too much of a problem, I hope. But yeah, there's only one way to find out, and that is to get on with it. So fingers crossed, here we go. Okay, so not conclusive news, but having looked in this port underneath the bottom bracket here, it does appear that there are 2 cable routing guides that run down underneath the bottom bracket. So I can only hope that they connect directly to this faceplate at the front here. Again, fingers crossed that is the case, and I won't have too much of a problem running these cables through. So yeah, now I do need to rip the cables out and just get on with it. Okay, so having pulled the cables out, I thought I would just try pushing an old shift cable up through the back end of the cable routing guide to see if it would come out, but it kept getting stuck about 4 or 5 inches from the end of the tube, and I couldn't quite push it through. It felt like something was blocked in the tube, and I couldn't quite figure out what it was. I tried a little bit of copper cable up there as well, thinking if there's a blockage I need something a little sturdier than a gear cable, so I pushed that up there, still couldn't get any further. So eventually I had to resort to taking the cable routing guide out, and actually what I found is that the routing guide was slightly depressed, so the cable just couldn't force its way through. However, I've now pinched the cable routing guide back into place, and a gear cable does slide nice and smoothly back and forth in that now. So now that's sorted. I'm not going to put this back in just yet, I'll leave it out for now, but when I put this back in later, I'm hoping that the cables should slide through nice and easily. Okay, so now that that's done, I'm going to go ahead and start removing the hoses and drain all of the mineral oil that's in there into a little pot so it doesn't start going everywhere. So let's get on with taking the hoses out. Right, well, the easiest way to bleed the mineral oil out of the brakes is just to open the bleed port at the back, as I have, and then just pump the brake and the oil should hopefully come streaming out. There's a fair bit of oil in the cap here, so hopefully that would have taken the majority of it out of the hose, and so when I take the hose out of the caliper, we shouldn't have oil spilling everywhere. Right, well, that hose seems stuck in the caliper good and proper, so I'm just going to cut the hose where it is and leave myself enough inside the caliper to be able to get some grips on it later to pull it out, but also enough to put my cable routing barb in the end of it to pull it back through the frame. Okay, so now I've got that hose cut, I'm just going to use my mounting tool or cable routing guide tool, which consists of a number of different barbs that you can put into the end of the hose, and then you use a length of cable with a magnet on the end of it that magnetizes to the bottom of the barb that you push into the cable, and then you can pull that all the way through the frame, and that will give you a guide to run the hose back through when you need to pull it through. I don't need to worry too much about the front brake because that just goes straight down into the head tube, down the inside of the fork and out, so that one is fairly easy to run. It's always the one that goes down the down tube and has to come along the rear chainstay that is a bit of a problem. Now, this kit can also be used if you have completely lost all of the hoses or the cable guides or the cable housings going through the frame, or if it's a brand new frame and you don't have the cable guides running through it anyway. You can use this magnetic end of the wire to poke down through any kind of aperture, the top of the top tube, the bottom, or even from the back of the bike, and then you use this very strong magnet and guide it along the inside of the tube to the point of the bike where you need it. So this tool is very, very handy if you are doing any sort of internal cable routing. So I'm going to get the barb put into the end of the hose now and start pulling my magnetic cable through. Okay, well, after what was quite the adventure, taking all of the hoses, the cables, and getting this giant conductor unit off the front of the bars, I now have an empty bar, a completely bare frame, a bare fork, and I think we finally stripped the bike of all its components. Now the only thing to do is get this cleaned up, and then we can start building everything back on. I'm hoping that the rebuild will be slightly easier than I expected the strip down to be, because yeah, being quite honest, that took a lot longer than I expected it to. But it's now done, so let's move on to the good bit, getting it clean and getting it built back up. Okay, and so by the miracle of modern technology, a few seconds later, we have a beautifully clean bike and a beautifully clean fork down on the floor. Now, before I go ahead and throw everything back on the bike, or the new stuff on the bike at least, I thought it'd be interesting to see just how much the old Tiagra kit weighs compared to the new 105 kit that I'm going to be putting on. So let's do that now. And I'm actually going to weigh the new 105 kit first because that is nice and gleaming and clean and new, and this lot is absolutely filthy, and I don't want to transfer any of the dirt from this kit onto the scales and then onto the new kit. So let's do the new kit first. Okay, so starting off with the crank, and the new 105 crank comes in at 780 grams. Moving on to the front derailleur, that comes in at 95 grams. The rear derailleur 105 comes in at 245 grams. The brake calipers, including hoses, they come in at 337 grams. The shifters, complete with shift cables, come in at 662 grams. And the new 105, including the quick links, that comes in at 264 grams. And then finally, the huge new 12-speed 11 to 36 cassette, that comes in at 382 grams. Right, now let's see how that compares to the old kit. Okay, so because some of this old kit is so dirty, I've decided to put a little bit of kitchen roll down, but don't worry, I have zeroed out the kitchen roll, so we're not counting the 2 or 3 grams that that's going to weigh. So we have, first of all, the 10-speed cassette, which comes in at 401 grams, and then we have the absolutely filthy 10-speed chain and links, and that comes in at 266 grams. Moving on to the rear derailleur, and that is 278 grams. The front derailleur, which is 93 grams, so that's actually just a couple of grams less than the new 105 one, so that's quite interesting. And then we have the brake calipers, not forgetting the hoses. and that comes in at 369 grams. And then nearly at the end now, and we have the old Tiagra crank, and that is 927 grams. So that is a fair bit of difference to the new 105 one. It'd be interesting to see just how much difference that makes to the overall weight of this entire kit. And then last but not least, we have the shifters with the conduct unit. Now, this was a bit of a pain to get on the scale, so I had to do this separately in a different video, but this came in at 795 grams. So yeah, quite a bit of extra weight with that conduct unit on the front. Right, so all told, and I'm going to take these gloves off now because they are absolutely filthy, and again, I don't want to get the new kit dirty, but all told, the weight difference is about 360 to 370 grams lighter for the new 105 kit, so that is pretty interesting. Now, 360, 370 grams isn't the heaviest weight in the world, but it is still a fair amount in the road world, so it'll be interesting to see what Cliffy makes of it when I've built it all back up and if he notices any difference. Right, so with all of that out of the way, it's time for the exciting bit, putting it all back together. Let's go. Okay, so for all my gung-ho, let's do this-ness with putting all the bits back together, you may well notice I'm now wearing a new t-shirt because it is a new day. I did want to get everything put on to the bike yesterday, but as is often the case with a young family, I got called inside to deal with some family matters and never got a chance to come back out. But as I say, it's a new day, we're back in the garage, and now I am definitely ready to start putting everything back onto the bike. And the first thing I'm going to do is start running the hose for the rear brake, because I need to do that before I start putting the fork back up through the head tube. But once I've done the rear brake, then I can work on the front brake and the front fork, and then I can start running some cables. So let's definitely get on with that now. Right, okay, well, having said that the front brake would be not a problem, it ended up being a bit more difficult and a bit more hard work than running the hose for the rear one. It's strange because on my Seraph gravel bike that I recently built, the brake hose goes up into the side of the fork here, and it is just a single channel inside that then pops out through a hole in the bottom of the steerer. So you just push the cable in and it automatically feeds itself out. Unfortunately, no shade to Giant here, but that isn't how this one is made, and it just disappears up into the fork and then into the void of the steerer. So if you keep pushing, it will end up going out the top of the steerer. It doesn't automatically push it out of the hole here. So I had a bit of a problem. First of all, I tried getting a gear cable in there to try and pull it out, and then I had to get a screwdriver, the end of a screwdriver in there, to kind of prise the hose forward while pushing up to get it out. So that was a bit of a problem, but it's now in, which means I can now get the fork up in, I can get all of the bits and pieces on top, and then start running the cables. But yeah, that was a bit of a problem. Also, with the rear brake hose, I never ended up using the wire that I pulled through from my magnetic mounting kit, because actually the hose just pushed through very nicely and then came out into the head tube anyway. I thought I'd give it a go trying it that way before I messed around with putting barbs into the end of the hose and pulling it through that way, and actually it went through really easily. So yeah, the rear brake was a hell of a lot easier than the front one, but as I say, now that's done, we can push on. Okay, so I'm at the point now where I need to put the handlebar on to start putting the shifters on and then running the cables through the cable guide to the front and rear derailleur. Now, one thing I did envisage and ordered, but it hasn't quite arrived yet, is a new stem faceplate to replace the old conduct unit. Now, the reason I need to do that and I can't just use a standard faceplate is because this giant stem seems to have a larger than usual cutout that the bar sits into, and so the front part of the stem faceplate is actually a lot shallower than the rear part. Now, if you try to put a standard faceplate on there, which also has a larger curve at the front, it doesn't quite grip the bar enough. So, for the moment, because the new faceplate, the giant faceplate I've ordered, hasn't arrived yet, it will be here in a day or two, but I'm going to have to put the conduct unit back on for now, just to secure the handlebar in place. But once I've finished, I can easily take this off and then just replace it with the new faceplate. Right, so after an absolute nightmare of a job trying to get these cables through the bike, I finally managed it. It was fairly easy getting the cables down to the underside of the bottom bracket shell here. That wasn't a problem, but getting the cable along the chainstay and out of the rear port, that was a bit of an issue. I just couldn't get it to feed through, but eventually I once again used my trusty magnetic mounting kit and I just fed that into the rear port and it caught hold of the steel cable and I was just about able to push it through and pull it out with the magnet. So got that done. Now I can actually get on with the brake hoses. There are now 3 jobs on my list that I really do not enjoy doing. 1 is running internal routed cables, 2 is bleeding brakes, and the 3rd is wrapping bars. At least one of those jobs is done now. Now for the other 2. Now, as I've mentioned before in previous videos, many previous videos, I am no expert on bleeding brakes. So I'm going to go through this procedure, but I'm going to give no instruction on it whatsoever, and instead, as I always do, I'm going to leave a link below to a Park Tool video where Calvin Jones will explain the bleeding process much better than I ever could. So let's get on with the bleeding, and then once that's done, we can start putting all the major components back on, like the crank, the front and rear derailleur, and then the wheels on, and then it's only my dreaded job, the bar tape, left to do. But I don't think we've got too much left to do before we've got a fully working bike again. Okay, so that is the brakes bled, and that is 2 of the 3 jobs that I hate out of the way, and now I can get on, as I say, with putting the major components on the bike. And while I'm doing the crank, I just wanted to talk very briefly about this little preload screw. Now essentially this screws in to the non-drive side crank, and it just pulls the 2 sides of the crank together so that there's no lateral play in between them. Now it's important that you only do this up finger tight, because if you graunch it up too tight, then you are just adding resistance to the crank, and then when you're out on the road pedaling, you'll find that it's very difficult, you'll be losing watts, and it just grinds things away. It is not a very good way forward. So what you need is a little tool like this. Now there are many available on the market, but this just happens to be the official Shimano one, and this is the TLFC16. So all you do is use the tool to gently screw the preload screw into the crank, and to make it a bit easier for yourself, you can just hold the tool steady and turn the crank, which will turn the screw in, and then when you start to feel a little bit of a bite, just make sure that there's no lateral play in the crank and that the crank spins freely, and that is all you need. Again, if you do it too tight, then you're going to find that you're graunching the cranks around and it's not going to be very smooth. And then once that's in, don't forget just to tighten up the pinch bolts either side of the crank, making sure that the little retaining switch is pushed down into position. So that's it, and all you need is a Shimano TLFC16 or similar tool, and that will keep you pedaling smoothly out on the road. Okay, so we've come to the point where I'm putting the new 12-speed cassette on the old wheel. And the only difference here, the only thing we need to be mindful of is that we don't need the old 1.85mm spacer that went behind the old 10-speed cassette. When changing from a 10-speed cassette to a 12-speed cassette, most of these hubs, most of the Shimano hubs, are set up for 10, or in fact 9, 10, 11 and 12 speed. Obviously, as you go up the range, the space between the gears gets smaller and smaller, so the hub can accommodate all the gears. But despite that, the overall size of the cassette does get a tiny bit wider, which is why you no longer need this tiny spacer at the back of the cassette. So we can get rid of that and we can start putting the new cassette on. Okay, so next we come onto the chain, and as ever, it is covered in manufacturing oil or engineering oil, whatever you want to call it, and this stuff is purely to stop the chain going rusty while it's sat on the shop shelf or in the warehouse. It is no good for your chain whatsoever once you've got it on the bike, because it just becomes an absolute magnet for dust, dirt and grime on the road. So we want to do a good job of stripping as much of that off as possible using a dry cloth, because the last thing we want is to put our nice new shiny chain on and after the first dry ride or even wet ride, it's just covered in dirt and muck. So always wipe this engineering oil off first before putting the chain on, and try to pick out any little bits of kitchen roll that get left on there while you're cleaning it as well. Probably best to use a lint-free cloth to do this rather than kitchen roll that will just fall apart. But I will make sure it is completely free of kitchen roll by the time I put it on the bike. Okay, with the chain cleaned, I now need to size it onto the bike. And I'm going to use the usual method of going big ring to big ring on the bike, but bypassing the derailleur. Now again, like with bleeding, I am no good at giving instruction on how to size chains. So again, I'll link you to the Park Tool YouTube video below where Kelvin Jones will tell you exactly how to size a chain properly. Right, well that is running and shifting beautifully at the back, and I had thought that the 12-speed derailleur was going to be a little bit difficult to index because I've never worked on 12-speed before, but actually it was really, really simple, and so it now glides beautifully up and straight back down the range again, so that is very nice. Now I've got the back wheel on though, I can go ahead and tighten up the rear brake caliper. Now I purposely left that loose when I installed it earlier until I got the wheel in, because there's no point in screwing that down tight and finding that it's misaligned with the rotor, because then you'll just get a constant rub as the rotor's going around. So what I'm going to do now is get the other side of the bike, hold on to the rear brake lever, and that will engage the caliper onto the rotor and centralise it, and I can tighten it up from there, knowing that it's perfectly in line in the middle and we shouldn't get any brake rub. Right, that's spinning beautifully now, and as you can hear, literally zero brake rub, which is very nice. So now the next job to do is get the front derailleur wired up and indexed, and then we can put the front wheel on, get the front caliper aligned with that rotor, and then the final job of doing the bar tape. Let's get it. Lovely, and that is the front wheel on and the front brake caliper aligned to the rotor. So yeah, that's it. The bike is pretty much done, pedals on, and then final job, I know I keep saying it and I'm trying to avoid it and I know I can't, it's the bar tape, but I'm going to put it off for as long as I can. Let's get the pedals on. Right, greasy gloves off. There's no putting it off anymore. It's time for the bar tape, and I've gone for this complete no-name bar tape brand that looks suspiciously like Super Kaz. No comment on that, but it is from AliExpress, and as ever this cost £5 from AliExpress, so really not expensive at all. But I have used this brand, non-brand before. I bought it from the same store on AliExpress, and I use that for my gravel bike that I built recently, and it works perfectly. It hasn't started rolling off yet. It's nice and grippy, so I was happy to take a punt on Cliff's behalf to give it another go. And I have got a wonderful orange fading to black pattern to go perfectly with the frame. So yeah, no putting it off anymore. Let's get on with it. And as ever, I'm going to be using the insulation tape inside out method, wrapping it around the bar so the sticky side is on the outside, so then when I put the bar tape on, it will stick nice and snug to it. In that way, if the bike ever falls over or part of the bar tape becomes ripped, it won't all start coming unraveled, and you will be able to get home without losing all of your bar tape. And there we go, with the ceremonial pulling back of this hood, we are finally done, and I think it looks absolutely stunning, and Cliffy should be able to ride this for a good few years yet with that very new, very updated 12-speed Shimano setup. And so the only thing left to tell you is the full cost of this kit. So for the full 105 R7120 group set, Cliff paid just £345. Now, I've had this discussion previously on videos about whether this is kosher kit or not. The vast majority of comments I get are that the main bulk of the components are kosher. They just tend to be grey market imports. That is to say that they're built and designed for another market and then they're shipped to the UK for selling here. They were never designed for the UK market, but they ended up here via AliExpress. So, as I say, the vast majority of comments I get tend to suggest that there's just no money in counterfeiting the main components. The chain, however, yeah, that probably isn't a true Shimano 105 chain, but I have used a number of these chains over the years and I haven't had any major problems any more than I have with other chains. In fact, the Shimano ones that I buy from AliExpress have generally lasted longer than the true KMC ones that I've used. Really not a big fan of KMC. So yeah, £345 plus £5 for the bar tape, and eventually when it comes, the stem faceplate to replace that conduct unit. All in all though, I think up the front here, it looks a much neater affair, or at least it will do, as I say, when I get that new simple faceplate on the front. And otherwise, it looks like a beautiful bike. At least it is now. It's fully clean and gleaming. And Cliff, if you're watching, and I hope you are, try and keep it clean this time, please. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching. As ever, I hope you found that useful and interesting, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.